Okay, so welcome to the South Orange Library Lecture Series, Special Conversations. I'm Laura Sims, the moderator, and today I am so excited to welcome Shelly Eversley to the program. Shelly was a colleague of mine when I taught at Baruch College for a couple of years, and she was such a good friend, and she is also such a dynamic and brilliant professor, speaker, and writer. So we're very lucky to have her with us today. Shelly is interim chair of Black and Latinx studies at Baruch College, which is a CUNY. She teaches and writes about race, gender, and sexuality in American literature and culture. She's also professor of English and was academic director of CUNY's Faculty Fellowship Publication Program. She's the recipient of awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, Rubin, Whiting, and Kluge Foundations. So many awards. She is the author of several books and critical essays, and her new book project, which we'll be hearing about today, is called The Practice of Blackness: Cold War Surveillance, Censorship, and African American Literary Survival. And it recovers a history of Black writing and Black resistance that's been obscured by US censorship and surveillance. So I'm very excited to hear Shelly talk about this fascinating topic today. Please enjoy her talk, and then at the end, we will have some time for questions. So here's Professor Shelly Eversley.
Thank you, Laura, and you all can call me Shelly, of course. Thanks for having me. I am excited to share this, especially because this book isn't out yet. I'm just doing some revisions on the last chapter. And so my conversation today is coming from the introduction. So you get a shape of the book, and it tells an interesting story, hopefully, and one that includes libraries. So I thought this would be appropriate for today. Shanice, you can go ahead and get to the second slide if you want. The title of the introduction in this talk is Fugitive Texts, Outlawed Authors, and Black Literary Survival. Okay, I will read. America First, a right-wing political party, had been stalking the African-American poet Langston Hughes since as early as 1940. Their surveillance had determined he was an atheist and a communist, and they launched a campaign to protest Hughes's much anticipated lecture on his new autobiography, The Big C. In their effort to sabotage the event, the religious political group flooded the surrounding community with a flyer. And this is the flyer is the next slide, Shanice, the third slide. Attention, Christians, hear the distinguished Negro poet Langston Hughes, author of the following poem and a member of the American section of Moscow's International Union of Revolutionary Writers. The title is Goodbye, Christ, end quote. You can see that flyer, hopefully, on your screen. There you go. The leaflet included a copy of the poem, which was initially published in 1932 without Hughes's permission. Their inflammatory propaganda powerfully and effectively created a scandal that influenced the course and direction of Hughes's literary career, so that 1 month later, the Saturday Evening Post followed America First's example and published a photograph of their leaflet. The Post's mass circulation of this propaganda lent credibility to the vendetta, turning it into news and giving rise to a national platform for Christian anti-communist messaging. And following the Post, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, generated an archive on Hughes, starting with the leaflet and a quote synopsis of facts, quoting the language of America First. Today, this federal record, which is a compilation of rumor in the form of media clippings, redacted letters from anonymous informants, and selections of Hughes's writings, exceeds 500 pages. It now represents an archive of formal and institutional anti-Black surveillance and censorship, a practice that has shaped and obscured the contemporary history of African-American literature and culture. Shanice, you're welcome to stop sharing your screen for now. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Hughes's perilous situation was common among his peers, past and present. Surveillance is nothing new to Black folks. In fact, it is the fact of anti-Blackness, Simone Brown writes, reminding us about the many ways that race continues to structure surveillance practices. Her analysis elucidates the long history of surveillance and racism, particularly as surveillance helps create the kinds of boundaries that circumcise and reify now normalized notions of identity, social caste, and political belonging. She writes, she understands surveillance as a visual and epistemological practice that regulates social relations, one that assumes normalcy in everyday life, and one that also endangers and defines Black experiences. These dangers include threats of physical violence, civil rights disenfranchisement, and the precarity that surrounds Hughes and his career as a Black writer. My interest in Brown's project lies in the ways that it recognizes surveillance as a technology of social control. Importantly, also, it theorizes Black people's resistance to the controlling authority of surveillance as freedom practices. My forthcoming book attends to these practices that register resistance and literary survival as it explains and excavates African-American literature in the 1950s. The Practice of Blackness finds inspiration from recent descriptions of Cold War censorship and surveillance to read and discover surveilled and censored mid-century Black literature, to further excavate the ways in which power colors the literary historical record, and to explain how it shapes the still fragile relationships between Black writers, book publishing, and reading publics. I'm going to get back to that on the very end of this talk. This book's investment in the archive recognizes the authorizing powers of archival work as a means to destabilize the very notion of a canon, and it follows the long-standing Black feminist practice of historical recovery that has made Black women's authorship so visible. And as the mid-century is also the inaugural moment for new criticism, American studies, this book recognizes its archival work as a challenge to the very notion of apolitical scholarship. It takes seriously Toni Morrison's admonition that, quote, exercising the political from the life of the mind is a sacrifice that has proven costly. While Cold War censorship and surveillance has massively obscured African-American literary history, especially during its most zealous moment, African-Americans published more novels in the 1950s than in any prior era in US literary history. I just want to pause for a second there because we often think of like the Harlem Renaissance, for instance, as this moment of incredible literary productivity, and it was. But from 1945 and through 1960s, Black writers published an unprecedented 150 novels. Today, only a fraction of this incredible output is visible or available. Most of these novels are out of print, and many are written by women. This paradox is the point of entry for my book. How is it that Black writers published in record numbers, despite such vehement efforts to censor and silence Black intellectual thought? What kinds of topics and themes characterize their creative output? And why is this fact of history still obscure? The extraordinary output of African-American novels does not even include poetry and short stories, nor the rise of essays in a flourishing Black print culture. I'll just pause for a second here and remind you all that Gwendolyn Brooks, the poet, was the first Black woman to win a Pulitzer Prize, first Black person to win a Pulitzer Prize for literature, and she won it in 1950. This moment reflects a tremendously vibrant creative intellectual scene, despite the Cold War's imperial culture of red baiting, book burning, and censorship. Even as African-American authors achieved this visibility and recognition during the Cold War era, this book argues that the obscured writings of the period represent an important record of a Black literary majority, a creative output by the greater part of Black writers whose published work appeared beyond the technologies of racialized surveillance and censorship. The original research in my book explains the preponderance of what I'm calling Black literary defiance, a fugitive text, if you will, surviving against the powerful forces of surveillance and censorship, institutionalized, as I argue, as a weapon of social and political control. The Cold War was a local, domestic, and global battle for hearts and minds in which Blackness was a central issue. This is a point that's kind of shifting the way people are talking about the Cold War today. Integration, as you know, the Brown v. Board of Education decision was 1954. Integration, the wars in Europe and in Asia, and when I mean the wars, I mean the end of World War II on both sides, right? The Pacific and inside of Europe, as well as anti-colonial movements in Africa and the Caribbean, motivated US domestic and foreign policy interests that would secure the US intervention known as the American Century. William Maxwell and Francis Stoner Saunders, for instance, both historians, separately explain how US spy agencies manipulated intellectual life in the service of anti-communism. In his investigation of the FBI's influence on African-American literary criticism and history, Maxwell describes the federal agency's recruitment of elite white college students, mostly from Yale, who infiltrated major publishing houses to serve as, quote, ghost readers, who alerted government officials about subversive texts before publication. He documents how these readers became critics and authors whose state-sanctioned surveillance studies enabled them to forge letters and other documents meant to disrupt and derail Black literary and cultural critique. And in her well-documented assessment of the CIA, which was established with limitless funding in 1947, Saunders explains how this agency, quote, spied on tens of thousands of Americans, harassed democratically elected leaders abroad, plotted assassinations, denied these activities to Congress, and in the process, elevated the art of lying to new heights, end quote. By the early 1950s, owning a record by Paul Robeson, New Jersey Sun, was perceived as an act of subversion, and the FBI was encouraging citizens to report any suspicious behavior of their friends or neighbors. As Arthur Miller noted, even with, quote, the tiniest communist party in the world, the US was behaving as though it was on the verge of a bloody revolution, end quote. He describes government attacks against communism that reflected its larger investments in foreign policy interests that would secure the American century and its global superpower status. Its cultural cleanse followed the Nazi example and burned some of the same books that had been purged decades earlier, including by Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, and Helen Keller. And while America First worked in the service of social control, Hughes was part of the resistance. In the Chicago Defender, he warned readers that the zeal with which the feds sought to identify and prosecute communists was an indication of the state's willingness to condemn, quote, all who question the status quo, who question things as they are, all poor people, Negroes, Jews, unwhite Americans, unrich Americans, end quote. Hughes's 1949 editorial about the trial against 12 Communist Party leaders articulated the logic of Cold War red baiting, that the policing of dissent would inevitably turn toward Black Americans whose justifiable grievances about segregation, housing, and labor discrimination, voting rights, and unequal schools would render them adversaries to the state. He writes, quote, if the 12 communists go to jail, next on the jail list are Negro American leaders. After the leaders come the ordinary folks, end quote. Later that same year, the House Un-American Activities Committee had raised the stakes of Hughes's point. It forced Black baseball pioneer Jackie Robinson to testify in a televised hearing against Black acting trailblazer Paul Robeson and his, quote, communistic behavior. By 1951, the novelist Ann Petrie's former associate and friend Benjamin Davis was imprisoned following a conviction under the Smith Act. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who I'd just like to remind you all is one of the founders of the NAACP, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who, like Hughes, was not a member of the Communist Party, had recently survived an indictment and criminal trial for failing to register his short-lived Peace Information Center. Even with an acquittal and the federal government's failure to prove its accusations against Du Bois, it withheld his passport and crippled his ability to earn a living. I should just sidebar, later in the book, I literally described this trial and the ways in which the NAACP and so many others abandoned him for fear of government retaliation. And the only one, the who famously stood up for Du Bois and really assisted him in this time was surprisingly Albert Einstein, who at that moment was a rock star, as you might imagine in 1950. Albert Einstein and Du Bois were friends, and Albert Einstein knew that his prestigious status would garner the kind of media attention that would expose the outrage of prosecuting Du Bois, who by that point was a very old man. He died 10 years later. Wow. And when Du Bois and Robison were blacklisted by having their passports nullified and their professional opportunities curtailed, it was clear that no willful Black writer or artist committed to Black freedom struggles was safe from government sanctions. Government stalkers followed Hughes well before McCarthyism. According to the FBI's records, America's first manufactured controversy had successfully silenced Hughes in 1940. It states that while Hughes was scheduled to read in California, he, quote, did not speak on the announced program. Instead, he was forced to flee the event through a side door in order to protect his physical safety. Anti-communist harassment had threatened his career so much that in a statement marking the start of 1941, Hughes publicly distanced himself from the poem he had never meant to publish. He declared he had written it, quote, with the intention in mind of shocking into being religious people a consciousness of the admitted shortcomings of the church in regard to the condition of the poor and the oppressed of the world, particularly Negro people, end quote. He closed his statement, which he sent to a long list of editors and agents, quote, I have never been a member of the Communist Party. Certainly both Marxists and Christians can be cruel. Would that Christ came back to save us all, end quote. Still, in 1943, 2 years later, America First supporters protested his scheduled lecture at Wayne University in Detroit. Their leaflet falsely advertised Hughes as, quote, an atheistic communist, a self-confessed communist, and a notorious blasphemous poet, end quote. Their fabrications represent an important religious precedent for the zealous anti-communist government investigations, hearings, and criminal prosecutions meant to neutralize the practice of Blackness during the 1950s. Arnold Rampersad describes the volatile scene in Detroit that included a police escort for Hughes, an auditorium packed with students, a university president affirming his commitment to free speech, Hughes's declaration that, quote, he deplored the use of religion in the name of patriotism, end quote, and his support for, quote, a Christianity that fights the poll tax, a Christianity that fights race discrimination, a Christianity that fights lynching, injustice, and inequality for the masses, end quote. Indeed, this kind of political critique in the service of social and racial justice is consistent in Hughes's writing practice. Goodbye Christ, the poem in question, echoes a longstanding commitment among Black intellectuals who deliberately deployed art and rhetoric to expose the ethical hypocrisies that persist alongside US celebrations of freedom and democracy. Frederick Douglass is one example. His critique of religionists or Christians who support white supremacy and slavery is only one example of the kinds of activisms that have always been integral to African-American art and thought. When Hughes was called before the McCarthy Committee in 1953, first in a secret interrogation on March 24th, and then in a public televised session on March 26th, there is no question the summons was intended to instill fear in a Black author who published widely. At this point, I should say that, Langston Hughes was probably the most famous Black writer in the world. A federal marshal appeared at Hughes's home in Harlem with a subpoena on Saturday, and it specified no reason for the summons that was scheduled for the next Monday afternoon. With 2 days to prepare and no indication of what he should prepare for, Hughes was justifiably fearful about his future. Quote, his nerves were frayed by a high-tensioned anxiety that reduced him at times, to his dismay, to actual trembling, end quote. Roy Cohn, the attorney who had prosecuted the communist leaders and whose trial Hughes had warned against in 1949, led the undisclosed interrogation. The transcript of this meeting was first accessible to the public in 2003. This secret meeting, a meeting hidden from the public record for 50 years, reveals another example of the deep federal investment in shaping the contours of American literary history, African-American literary history in particular. McCarthy's Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation's interest in social dissent, it read Hughes's poetry, fiction, and journalism. It prompted it to question whether Hughes's work was included in the overseas library program where, quote, pro-communists were working. This is now McCarthy's big project was to keep an eye on the librarians who were pro-communist and advocating, who he believed were pro-communist and were advocating communism throughout the world. Senator McCarthy had claimed that the well-funded federal agency, the International Information Administration, the IIA, its libraries and the Voice of America programs employed subversives who misdirected its charge to propagandize American principles abroad. And while McCarthy's claim was grossly overstated, only 39 books could be described as definitively supporting a communist cause, this government interest confirms literature's powerful influence on culture and on politics. And if McCarthy, Cohn, and their allies were fearful that literature could undermine the nation's global ambitions, then a politically engaged African-American literature could change the world. The Senate Committee's interrogation of Hughes runs parallel to national interests in managing propaganda in the Cold War's battleground for hearts and minds. McCarthy's vendetta with the US Department of State and the IIA included his anti-communist conservative challenge to the Voice of America network and the 200 information centers located abroad. With a $100 million budget, which would still be huge for any library today, right? With a $100 million budget and with staff all around the world, the IIA and its overseas library program had tremendous influence on the very hearts and minds McCarthy's anti-communist message sought to claim.
I have a lecture going from the library, but I just...
Sorry, can you mute yourself?
It's still on.
The Government Committee on Operations had blacklisted more than 30,000 books it had deemed subversive. McCarthy and his team chose to target authors whose books were purchased by the IIA and State Department in order to identify particular employees and punish them.
When you're done, you go home.
Hughes was part of a representative group of authors whose work would bring the Senate committee one step closer to its larger mission. Quote, the next important thing is to try and pin down the responsibility and find out who personally selected these books, end quote. Anti-communist interest in libraries, in an international public's access to information and art, is a recognition of the influential power of books. And like children in schools, readers in libraries could discover and justify cause for social and political critique. So, for instance, within an hour of the court's ruling of Brown v. Board of Education, the Voice of America broadcast the news to communist Eastern Europe as proof that American Negroes would remain democratic citizens. They did the same in all of the countries in Africa, which at that moment were advocating for their own independence. In the New York Times, American diplomat Chester Bowles inadvertently explained the Brown decision's role in Cold War politics. Quote, he writes, the world situation and our responsibilities of leadership tells us the struggle for the very survival of the free way of doing things requires America to show that democratic methods can solve deep-rooted injustice. African news reports celebrated the decision as a victory for all Black people. And a 1954 Emancipation Proclamation, this is a quote from the National Security Council, the decision is regarded as the greatest event since the Emancipation Proclamation, and it removes from communist hands the most expensive and effective anti-American weapon they had in Black America, end quote. And so the idea here is that with the announcement of the Brown decision and the desegregation of public schools, that they could then the United States would no longer be called hypocrites, as in practicing apartheid like South Africa, and now they've overturned apartheid effectively, was the argument. Now part of an international public relations campaign to win hearts and minds, Brown served to counter global anti-American sentiments in the US as it was becoming a superpower. In reading the recently released transcripts of the secret public and government public interrogations, Hughes did not cooperate, nor did he name communists. Instead, he described his writing as something informed by his experiences with American apartheid. Since the complete archive of Hughes's first encounter with anti-communist government interrogators had been buried in a government archive, closed for the entire second half of the 20th century, generations of readers and scholars could not tell and could not know the full extent of Hughes's resistance to federal intimidation and the conservative interest determined to mute his politically engaged anti-racist literary practice. I am interested in the ways in which African-American writers and intellectuals are historical agents who crucially shape the terms and the language of post-war American identity, despite the censorship, despite the surveillance and intimidation that served as important technologies for the Cold War containment that sought to erase the complete record of writers and artists who seriously engaged the ethics of American democracy. As I close my talk today, and Shanice, you can go ahead and share your screen again with that fourth slide. As I close my talk today, I'd like to point out these concerns urgently remain. In October 2020, a member of the Texas State House of Representatives circulated a watch list of 850 books in the state public libraries. In response to government pressure, a school district in San Antonio pulled 425 of them from its school libraries. Some of the books now banned, you can, the next slide, I think, include cast. You can, oh, sorry, it's the slide before, I think, Shanice. Include Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, Ibrahim Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist, Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, Phyllis Reynolds Naylor's Reluctantly Alice. I put in that slide a link to the book list of all the 850 books that were on the watch list in Texas. And this Texas watch list came out in 2020 in October. I just put it in the chat if you wanted to see it. Okay. And then, where's my talk? I just lost it. Oops. And I could go on, of course. And instead, I encourage you to pay attention and to consider the implications for future generations. So for instance, in Arizona, the interest in banning books are particularly interested in Chicano history, where the Mexican-American and Latinx populations are growing faster than anyone had ever imagined. And they are quickly becoming the population majority in the state of Arizona. And in Detroit, many books around Black history are banned. And I invite you to not just take my word for it, but to see for yourself. The last slide there, Shanice, you see it? Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Shelly Eversley. Thanks. And now we can talk.
Yay. Thank you so much, Shelly.
I know these Zoom talks are sometimes, you can go ahead and stop sharing the screen, Shanice, and thank you very much for being my technical support.
Yes, thank you, Shanice. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Shelly. That was really fascinating.
Glad.
I was just wondering are you one of the first scholars who's working on putting all of this together?
Yes and no. I'm one of the first who's actually reading the books.
Okay.
Like all the books that have been banned, I've been tracking down, and I've probably got my hands on about 90 of them. And so I actually write about some of them.
Those books. And you mean the books from the 1950s by Black authors that you were talking about, the novels, right?
Yes. Because I'm interested in the publishing history, the story of publishing. I mentioned today the ways that they had ghost readers at major presses. And then there was a rise of a whole bunch of independent presses that sort of flew a little bit under the radar. And there you could see a lot of people sort of talking about, intersectionality before we even had that word. So,
Right.
Some of the women writers are writing using voices of domestic workers, talking about their need for job security and fair wage. And then there are writers like James Baldwin, most famously, but also Richard Wright and a bunch of novelists that you maybe never heard of, wrote novels that featured exclusively white people.
Huh.
And in those novels, it was almost like a cover. So then in those novels, then the white characters, the white protagonists could then talk about all kinds of social injustices that maybe they could have gotten away with that a Black person would not have been allowed,
Right.
a Black character.
Oh, that's interesting. And who are some of the authors that you've been reading? Are there,
Well, the novelists and writers.
Some of them, but.
Well, the critics who inspire me, Mary Helen Washington, who is at the University of Maryland, Lawrence Jackson at Johns Hopkins, Simone Brown at University of Texas, and William Maxwell, who's at the University of Washington in St. Louis, are critics that I am in conversation with. And some of the novels, I don't really talk about, say, Ralph Ellison, for instance, whose 1952 novel Invisible Man was the first by an African-American to win the National Book Award. Mm-hmm. But I do mention and notice that when Brooks won the Pulitzer Prize in 1950, like when Ellison won the National Book Award in 1952, there was such an outrage about it that there was no one given an award the following year.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And it's also, and so, I sort of put them in context because we've heard of these writers, right? Mm-hmm. But I write about Richard Wright a little bit in his travels in Africa. Richard Wright left the United States in 1944 and never came back. James Baldwin left, I write about him. He left the United States also. Well, Richard Wright left in 1941. James Baldwin left in 1948. And most of the works, like his most famous book, Giovanni's Room, was not allowed to be published in the United States. It was absolutely censored. And as some of you may know, that novel is celebrated as the first out gay novel in American literature. I argue that's not really true. I show a few other novels by the very obscure Thelma Womble, for instance, and less obscure, but sort of varied Chester Himes that feature out homosexual relationships. And in Thelma Womble's case, she wrote a book called All in the Family. And in that novel, which is really hard to get your hands on, it is available in the archive at the Schomburg Library, New York Public Library, Schomburg Center. That book features an intersex person who is not, and so there's all this conversation about transgender identity and gender identity and the sort of social constructedness of it. And that book came out in 1953, the same year as Giovanni's Room, and it was published in the United States. Giovanni's Room was first published in England, and it was such a success in England that only after it was a success in England could it be published in the United States. I write about Ann Petrie. She's the only writer in my book who does not have an FBI file. And I will say that Ann Petrie was probably almost as famous as Langston Hughes and Richard Wright at this moment. She had written a book called The Street, a novel called The Street. And when they arrested and imprisoned her friend, she fled. She moved to, suburban Connecticut with her husband, had children, and literally wrote her next novels by hand. She wrote them by hand. She did not have any manuscript copies. She stayed out of the press and she remained out of the public eye until she died.
But she continued publishing?
She continued publishing, and she continued publishing these sort of novels that look like domestic novels set in the suburbs of Connecticut. But on a closer read, and I do a reading about that, I believe that she's making an argument about privacy, and the ways in which exercising her right to privacy, and really guarding her privacy was her only protection from censorship and surveillance, especially given that she worked so closely with people like Robison, Du Bois, and others who were persecuted.
Right. And why do you think she wasn't persecuted?
One, men didn't take women. The FBI didn't take women as seriously as they did men. And she left town at the beginning when things started getting hot. Like she left by, 1941, she left the city. And so, in 1950, I think she left the city, in 1949, when her friend Benjamin Davis was imprisoned. And Hughes is interrogated in 1953. Du Bois is interrogated and indicted in 1950. So she sort of saw the writing on the wall. Right. I also write about Alice Childress, and her FBI file is interestingly short. It's about 60 pages, which it's short in terms of the length. James Baldwin's FBI file is longer than his publications, about 2,000 pages. Same with Richard Wright. It's more than 2,000 pages, his file.
Wow.
Yeah. And Hughes is 500 very long pages. And you can read much of this now. It's because of freedom of information filings. You can read much of it, but it's very, very redacted.
Still.
Yeah. And I'm interested in this. I'm interested in the public in the federal archive, if you will, the federal library of its surveillance of writers. And in my case, I'm interested in the federal surveillance of Black writers, but one could actually go dig in and find all kinds of writers and artists who have very, very large and long-standing FBI files.
Wow.
I mean, there's a in the files I was reading about Frank Yerby and some other more obscure African-American authors. And there was this one writer who kind of fled, and he went down to Puerto Rico, which was, a territory, beginning to be a territory of the United States. He went to Puerto Rico, and the FBI agent is describing himself sitting under the window of this writer's bedroom, listening to the typewriter move. There are stories about FBI agents pursuing Alice Childress in this ginormous apartment building in Harlem. They are waiting outside of the entrance that she went in, only to find out that she used an entrance on the side to escape them. There are poems from Richard Wright, who basically wrote an essay called "I Tried to Be a Communist" in 1944. And that was the only way that he got a visa to France. And he took his family to France. There are, Richard Wright wrote a poem called FBI Eyes, because everyone was aware of being surveilled and followed. If you imagine today, our surveillance practices are, our phones do all the work for anyone who wants to follow us, right? Yep. But back then it was human labor.
Yeah.
And sometimes it was one agent or two agents who spent 24 hours following, not taking pictures, but taking narrative and deciding what they would say.
Oh my God, that is crazy.
Yeah.
This is not to undercut the seriousness of your research, but while you've been talking, all I can think is this has got to be a TV show or a movie. And I think that you should write a treatment alongside your academic book.
I love you, girl. Yes. Maybe finally I get that payday that
I'm serious. This is so good.
I'm trying to tell a story that is riveting. I mean, and one thing that I know teaching at CUNY, the City University of New York, which, as you know, is educates 500,000 students in the New York metro area, many of them working class and first generation college students. I'm really interested in making sure that our scholarly work is accessible, that we write it and we tell the story in a language that any smart, curious person can understand and sort of understand the stakes, which is something I think academia doesn't always do, right? Sometimes we love the obscure language so much so just to sound smart that we limit our readers and our audiences by doing that. And when you have something to say, right, this is what we tell students and this is what we do when we read books, we get into the story. And so I'm trying really hard to tell a story here.
You are. Yeah.
With documentary evidence.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story.
Thanks.
Yeah. Do other people have questions, since I've been dominating here? But questions? Marcia?
I have a couple questions. Thank you very much. This was so informative and really important things that we need to know, especially now as well, because of what you were saying. These lists are still coming out. I guess one of my questions is, do the people on these lists, like from Texas, et cetera, do they have FBI files, these authors now?
Censored?
I believe yes. I don't, we know some of these authors, if they're living, they have to file their own Freedom of Information Acts. And so very often in my work, in the archival work, you wait. It's terrible, not to invade people's privacy. You do this when someone dies, right? And some files are frozen. So for instance, the secret interrogations, government interrogations on Langston Hughes were closed until 50 years after, till 2003. His interviews were in 1953. The same is true for, there are some psychiatric records about Richard Wright. Those are closed until 2020. There's all that stuff. So I would imagine, yes, we could actually trace the ways that the FBI has surveilled not just Black people, but for my purposes, Black people, Black intellectuals and activists and artists since the beginning of time, right? So when I say the beginning of time, I mean the beginning of the United States and its colonies from slave patrols during slavery. You needed a pass, you needed a piece of paper to be able to walk freely on the road if you were a free person. And very often that piece of paper, right, that Black person couldn't even read, but they guarded it with their lives because it meant their lives. Forward, right, you can go into the 1960s and there was an initiative called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, that surveilled, and he literally planted agents into organizations like the NAACP, not just the Black Panther Party, right? There were agents who were planted inside the women's movement and the gay rights movement. In the 1950s, the anti-communist interests lied very, very squarely among Jews, among queer people, and among Black people. By the 1960s, it kind of intensified its interest in Black people, because as we saw, there's lots of civil rights actions and activities going on, but also women's rights movements. And they were doing everything from listening outside of someone's bedroom in the gay rights movement. So the very famous case, Bowers v. Hardwick, is an argument about LGBT rights to privacy in their bedrooms, because how would a government know that you were having gay or lesbian sex unless you were in their bedroom? And in fact, the government was in their bedroom. They were literally sitting outside the window listening to people type. They were literally peering into the window to see if Bowers was having romantic encounters with another man. So this is something, and you think about it. Laura, you want to get to pop culture. How is it that Britney Spears' father can put a bug in her bedroom? How is it that her father could listen to her in conversation with her children, much less having sex?
Right. Yeah. I see it on the screen.
Yeah. And this is about social control. Again, this is about social control. And it's not just about Black people trying to overthrow a government. It's about a government maintaining its power by controlling all of these forces and all of these different populations that have legitimate reasons to question the ethics of democracy. As we know too, right, that the Brown decision, while it became public and celebrated in 1954, schools remained segregated. And we saw, right, in the 50s and the 60s, all the ways in which government, elected public officials were working to ensure that segregation remained. And one of Martin Luther King's brilliant moves, right, was to offer visual representations of that, right? So that we could see images of police brutality, so that people could say, hold on, I never knew that was happening. You can hear about it, but if you see it, theoretically, you might believe it. Interestingly enough, 50 years later, we don't even believe what we see.
Nope. I know.
People don't even believe what they see. And that's part of the messaging too. And I use the language that they use, right? Propaganda, for instance. Propaganda by definition is just a word. It's like a campaign, like an ad campaign. I could say ad campaign, PR plan, but calling it propaganda kind of turns the mirror, I hope, on the kinds of surveillance and censorship that no one's really questioning. And obviously continues today. Marcia, you had more questions. Sorry.
No, it goes along with that, with the documents that you're looking at that were, Freedom of Information Act able to be opened, and they're redacted. If there's only like one copy in the file, how, like, the things that are redacted, will they ever be able to be known what was redacted?
That's a great question. The best part about libraries for me is the archive, right? And so what's really interesting is you get these redacted files from the FBI, and then you see a redacted letter that maybe Langston Hughes wrote to his lawyer, or maybe he wrote to an obscure person. And then my job is to go find that obscure person's archives and see if someone got to that letter, right? Because the truth is the FBI is not as meticulous as I am, right? About the archive, right? Because we know that there's lots of ways for us to find information, like who was at that reading in 1941. You can actually go to the hosts and they have an invitation list. Maybe there's photographs and you can identify some of the photographs. Also letters and correspondences. So for instance, this is how I know that Ann Petrie wrote her books by hand. She did not type them.
Yeah.
So that there was no ribbon that one could reproduce. Because, the FBI was also like going in people's trash and taking out typewriter ribbons.
God. Wow.
That's amazing. And also that she went to Connecticut to hide, which is so interesting.
Absolutely. Especially
I think I would do that now.
I know. Well, she was an interesting one because she was a very upper middle class Black woman. Her father and aunt were pharmacists in Saybrook, Connecticut, which was near the water. And they grew up the only Black family in this town. And, she grew up with, privilege. And so she went home.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
That makes more sense.
Yeah.
How did you first get interested in this topic? And how long have you been working on it?
I've been working on it forever. Way too long, which is why I can't wait to see the end of this book. The last revision. I got into it because I first started thinking about Gwendolyn Brooks, who is a poet that sort of changed my approach to thinking about stuff. And Gwendolyn Brooks, when she won the Pulitzer Prize in 1950, she was talking about, critics would refer to her as a poet who didn't seem like a Negro poet, which is the word they used in 1950. And what they meant was that her diction was as good as any white poet. And they tried to elevate her because she wrote sonnets and she wrote, in very traditional, long-standing poetic forms.
Right.
And I was interested in that. And then I started getting deeper into it. And I'm really like, why is it that this is the compliment? You don't write like a Negro. And then I was like, well, what does Negro writing look like? And ultimately in 1950, there's this huge moment of criticism and celebrations of Black writers coming of age, they called it. And they said that they didn't have to write about Negro topics. They didn't have to write about race. If they wanted to be mature authors, they wanted to be successful, then maybe they shouldn't write like Black poets and artists. Wow. And then I was like, well, what does that mean? And then we can keep going, right? And it's like, oh, you're not supposed to write a native son. You're not supposed to write beloved, which, by the way, is banned in Arizona and Texas, and some Detroit public schools. So there you have it.
And did you like have you enjoyed the parts of the research, like tracking down the files and everything? Sounds like a detective work, It
is. It's super fun. And, but, at this point I'm like, okay, Shelly, just stop. Like, do not go back to the archives. Just hit send, just send it. And maybe there'll be a part 2 or the book, or someone else can take up where I left off, because literally I published the list of books. I will include the list of books, all 150 of the novels, so that some other grad student or some other person can pursue them like I did, and they can pick up where I left off and find what I didn't find.
Yeah. Yeah. And is Langston Hughes the focus of the book, or just one of the focuses?
He's one of. I'm interested in Hughes because this is what I'm rewriting now. The book begins and it ends with Hughes. Langston Hughes he just wanted to be a writer. Yeah. And I'm fascinated by that. Like, he writes, in 1956, he writes a second autobiography. And it's kind of like his response to all the hunting, the red baiting that he experienced in the last 10 years of his life. And he says, I just wanted to be a writer. And he did go to Russia, by the way. And he's like, and I did write that poem. But he's like, why wouldn't I go to, I wanted to go everywhere. And in 1931, when he went, he also went to Cuba. He went to Mexico. He was fluent in Spanish because his father lived in Mexico City. He went to Japan. He went to China. He went to Spain, where, Franco, this dictator, is still running around. He went to France. He did most of these things, like, jumping aboard ships and working as a deckhand, and then jumping off and getting rides, by boat. And he traveled the world, and he was, 20 some years old. And that's what we encourage people to do. Right. And he makes this note, and I'm surprised too, because he makes this note. First, he goes down into the historically Black colleges and universities. He goes on tour and he speaks. And in that tour, he meets a whole bunch of poets and writers who become famous in the 60s and 70s. And on this tour, he's not allowed to stay in hotels because he's Black. So he has to be taken in by people. And he describes this. But interestingly, that tour also created his popularity, because there wasn't, the internet creating the hype around a person. He becomes popular, and then he goes around the world for a few years. And he does all kinds of things. He tries to write a movie. He had tried to write plays before he went off during the Harlem Renaissance. He tried to write some plays. He tried to write a movie. It didn't work out. Somebody invited him to direct a movie. It didn't work out. He got paid for, giving a couple talks, and he used the money to travel more. Huh. He's basically kicked out of Japan because he goes to meet with some actors and writers who the Japanese government are confused about, partly because Japan and China have its tensions. And they're like, well, why did you go to China? Oh, right. He's like, why wouldn't I go to China? I mean, it's China, so there's that. And so I'm interested in that, because all along he says, I just wanted to be a writer who made a living writing.
Right.
And this is what every writer wants.
Right.
You don't want a side job where you write you want to be a writer who makes a living writing. And that is the most sort of innocuous thing a person could do. Like, I just want to write some poems. I know you can relate, Laura, and like you, Laura, Gwendolyn Brooks was known for her poems. She began as a poet, and she realized that poems don't pay. So she wrote a novel.
Yep.
And with the advance from that novel, she got a down payment for her house.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I can totally relate.
And so that's how she became a novelist. And she only wrote one novel because she was a poet.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's fun. And those little details keep me going,
I bet. Yeah, I can see why this would go on and on, because you just want to keep digging in.
Yeah.
There's so much. This is why it would need to be a long-running TV series instead of just a film. Okay.
You write it. I'll give you the book and we can split the difference because I don't know how to write. I don't know that I have the skills.
Okay. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Shelly. This was awesome and so fascinating. Does anyone have a last question before I wrap things up?
I have another question.
Yeah.
It's actually for you, Laura. I was wondering about libraries and when these lists of censored books come out in like Texas, does a place like the South Orange Library look at that list and make sure they have the books?
We definitely make a big deal of like, there's like a banned books week where you kind of highlight all the books that are banned in different places. So definitely, we're aware of those books and try to like highlight them in the collection.
Excellent.
So, yeah.
Sure.
Well, thank you all for coming. And thank you again so much, Shelly. This was really fascinating. I can't wait for you to finish the book. And
Thank you.
write our screenplay together. And,
yes, I'm in.
And thanks to people for coming. Thank you to Shanice for your help today. And I just want to remind people that our next program is February 4th with author Michael Shine, who wrote a book called The Hype Handbook. And his talk is called Marketing is for Morons, Using Hype to Attract Attention to Your Work. And this is relevant not just to like business owners or business people. It's great for artists and writers too. So please join us again. And thank you so much, Shelly.
Thank you all for making time today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you, Shanice.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Shelly.